I would like to show you one of the most beautiful games of the world champion Vasily Smyslov. He intuitively sacrificed his queen to start a very strong attack on the enemy king with his remaining pieces. With every move, Smyslov improved the piece coordination and eventually reached the perfect harmony, creating deadly threats to the enemy king. Smyslov played the English opening, c4, and his opponent Liberzon played e5. Knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7 and rook b1, preparing the immediate pawn storm on the queen side. d6, b4, a6, preventing white from playing b5. And Smyslov played e3. He's going to attack the center after finishing the expansion on the queen side. And black, in his turn, is going to start the counterplay on the king side, f5. Now both sides finish the development first. Knight e2, knight f6, d3, short castle, bishop d7, a4. Now there is nothing black can do to prevent b5, attacking the knight. And after the knight retreats, the pawn on b7 will be unguarded. That's why black plays rook b8, defending the pawn. And of course b5 followed. A takes b, a takes b, and knight e7. And Smyslov plays bishop a3. We will see the idea of this move very soon. So, Smyslov has finished the expansion on the queen side and grabbed space. And now, it seems that everything is ready for the attack of the center, namely d4. That's why black moves his bishop, which is passively placed on d7, to a better diagonal. To a better square, e6, from which the bishop controls a very important diagonal and prevents white from playing d4, because in this case the c4 pawn would fall. That's why Smyslov plays queen b3, defending the pawn, and now there is nothing black can do to prevent d4. For example, if black plays c5 in order to take under control the d4 square, now we can see the idea behind bishop a3. Smyslov would have simply captured on b6, and after b takes c and the mass exchanges on b8, it turns out that the pawn on d6 would simply fall. So, as there is nothing black can do to prevent white from playing d4, black simply played b6, and of course d4 followed, creating an immediate threat, namely d takes e, and after d takes e, the d file would open and Smyslov would have played rook d1, taking under control the open d file with tempo, attacking the queen, and also after the exchange on e5 and disappearance of the d pawn, the bishop would have become much stronger. That's why, in order to prevent all this and to keep the d file closed, black played e4. And Smyslov continues grabbing space, d5, taking under control the very important e6 square, which is weakened, and also vacating the d4 square for his knight, and the knight from d4 will jump either to e6 or to c6. The bishop is under attack, so bishop f7, and knight d4, of course. So, knight e6 looks like very unpleasant, that's why black played queen e6, strengthening the control over the e6 square. And now that the bishop has finished its mission on this diagonal, Smyslov moves it to a better diagonal, to the long diagonal. And of course the bishop is much better placed on b2. So before making the committal moves, such as knight c6 for example, Smyslov is going to improve all his pieces, because black is squeezed and black doesn't have any counterplay. And if black just waits and doesn't do anything, then white will gradually increase the pressure, improve all the pieces, and squeeze black even more. That's why it's necessary to start the immediate counterplay. And that's exactly what black did. g5. So black is preparing f4 and also vacated the g6 square for the knight, which is currently very passive. But through g6, the knight, besides supporting the f4 advance, can also jump to e5, and from on e5 it would be ideally placed on a great central square, and also it might jump to d3 or f3. However, the g5 advance has a serious drawback. On g6, the pawn was defending the f5 pawn, and now that the pawn is on g5, the f5 pawn is weak. And Smyslov will exploit this. So first, Smyslov continues the improvement of his pieces. Knight e2. After the d4 knight jumps to c6, the d4 square will be vacated, and the second knight, which wasn't doing anything on c3, it simply didn't have any squares. From e2 it will jump on d4 and would be greatly placed on that square, attacking black's main weakness on f5. Black made a prophylactic move, king h8. Smyslov continues the improvement of his pieces, rook a1, taking under control the open file. And now knight g6, so it looks like black is ready to play f4 or maybe knight e5. However, Smyslov made a very strong prophylactic move, f4. So completely blockading the king side. Now black cannot play f4 and taking under control the e5 square. The knight cannot jump to e5 either. What to do now? If black captures on f4, then after the exchanges on f4, the f file is open, as you see, and after knight takes and rook takes, of course, the pressure on the f5 pawn would be very strong and it will fall. Or if black, instead of capturing on f4, plays g4, then the king side would be closed, it would stay closed, and black's counterplay on the king side would fail. That's why, after f4, black captured on f3. However, after rook takes f3, it turns out that the f file is open, and again white exerts very strong pressure on black's main weakness, on f5 pawn. Currently it's under attack, it's defended only by the queen. That's why the knight must return, knight e7, to defend the pawn. And now knight c6, attacking the rook. If black captures, then the knight, the defender of the pawn, would move away, and the defense of the pawn would be even more problematic. Besides that, white would capture on c6 with the pawn and would squeeze black even more, taking under control b7 and d7 squares. That's why black moved the rook to e8 to the half-open file. And, of course, now that the d4 square is vacated, the second knight jumps on this square and again attacks the f5 pawn. And Smyslov was going to keep pressing, to increase the pressure and to squeeze his opponent even more. That's why Liberzon made a desperate attempt to get some activity. He sacrifices the material. Knight takes d5, and after c takes d, bishop takes d5, the bishop attacks both the queen and the rook, and the bishop is defended, of course, by the knight on e7. So what to do now? If the queen moves, for example, queen c2, then black would simply capture the rook, and after bishop takes f3, knight g6, for the material, for the sacrificed material, black would get some compensation and activity. However, Smyslov found a brilliant solution instead of this. So what to do? The white queen is under attack. You can pause the video and try to find Smyslov's brilliant idea. So, Smyslov is going to sacrifice his queen in order to activate and create the harmonious coordination between his remaining pieces. And his pieces will be very active, as you will see. So currently, the knight on d4 is closing the bishop's diagonal. So Smyslov plays knight takes f5, leaving his queen under attack, but attacking the bishop 2 times. As you see, the g7 bishop is attacked, and in case black accepts the sacrifice, in case black captures on b3, Smyslov gives the following variation. Bishop takes g7 check, king g8, then knight takes e7, rook takes e7, bishop takes f8, king takes f8, the king is forced to move right under the discovered check. First, rook a8 check, activating the rook, and after king f7, knight d4, discovered check, and the bishop falls. And after king g7, knight takes b3, white is up materially and also positionally. White pieces are much more active, black pieces aren't really doing anything, and white continues the attack. So white is winning in this case. Instead of capturing the queen, if black captures the knight on f5 with his e7 knight, then, of course, the knight moves away from e7, from the square from which it defended the bishop, and the bishop would be unguarded, and white would simply capture the bishop, and after bishop takes b2, simply rook f1, creating a deadly pin. The knight cannot move because the rook on f8 would fall, and that means the knight on f5 will fall and white will simply be a piece up. That's why after knight takes f5, Liberzon captured on f5 with a rook. Rook takes f5. And Smyslov now captures the bishop. Bishop takes g7 check. And it turns out that in case black captures the bishop, then first white will move away the queen from the attack with tempo, queen c3 check, and after the king moves, white will simply capture the rook, and of course if the knight captures, then the bishop would be unguarded and white will simply capture the bishop with check, and after queen takes f5, simply e4 with a fork. Black must capture, and after bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, a strong and simple move, rook e1 attacking the queen, and after the queen retreats, the e7 knight will fall. That's why after bishop takes g7 check, black cannot capture the bishop, and Liberzon made a stronger move, king g8, and the queen is still under attack. And Smyslov sacrifices the queen again. He doesn't move it and instead captures the rook. And now the bishop is attacked 3 times, as you see, and black is simply forced to accept the queen sacrifice. Bishop takes b3. But now Smyslov starts a very strong attack on the black king. Rook takes g5. And there is a very unpleasant x-ray, and white is threatening to move the bishop with the discovered attack. That's why black plays knight g6, closing the bishop's line, and now it turns out that the g7 bishop is under attack. So bishop h6. So for the sacrificed queen, Smyslov got a very strong attacking chances. However, at first sight, his pieces don't coordinate very well. Especially the rook on a1 isn't doing anything. The bishop on h6 it doesn't look very well. However, now with every move, Smyslov will improve his pieces and eventually will reach the ideal harmony. So the black queen isn't very active either. It isn't really doing much. Of course, black cannot capture the pawn at the moment because of simple tactics. Rook takes g6 check, followed by bishop takes e3. That's why black played queen e6, trying to activate the queen and attacking e3 with check. However, Smyslov sacrifices this pawn. He doesn't pay attention to it, and instead defending this pawn, he finds one more hidden resource, hidden attacking resource, namely the side pawn, the h pawn, h4. So he vacated the h2 square for his king, and the king will be safely placed on h2, and also the main threat is to advance the pawn further and attack the knight, which is pinned. So Smyslov is simply threatening to win a piece. Black captured on e3, check, king h2, and now of course rook takes g6 check is threatened, winning the queen. That's why queen must move away from e3. Queen c3, and now the rook, which wasn't doing anything on a1, moves to f1, and the rook from f1 coordinates with the bishop very well. And it turns out that the rook cannot leave the 8th rank. If it moves, then white will immediately checkmate on f8 because the knight is pinned. So black played bishop c4, attacking the rook and also the b5 pawn, and simply rook f2 followed. Queen e1, attacking the rook one more time, and rook gf5. Now the pressure on the f-file increases, and white still is threatening to play h5, and after the knight moves, simply rook f8 checkmate. And here comes the decisive mistake by black. Black had to keep the bishop on this diagonal, because otherwise white will play bishop d5 check, so the bishop must defend this diagonal. However, Liberzon captures on b5. Instead, it would have been better to play bishop e6. The bishop would stay on this diagonal and attack the rook. In this case, black could have continued the resistance and the game would have been very complicated. Instead, Liberzon captures on b5. And now, of course, the white bishop can move to d5. Not immediately. First, of course, white cannot capture the bishop because the rook must defend the rook on f2. So first, Smyslov now starts the regrouping of his bishops. First, he moves the bishop to d2, attacking the queen, and the idea is to move this bishop to c3, and it will exert a terrible pressure, and the second bishop will move to d5, and these two bishops, together with the rooks on the f-file, will create checkmating threats. And there is nothing black can do to avoid this. So, the queen cannot move to a1 in order to prevent bishop c3, because in this case the b5 bishop would fall. Black would simply capture it. So the queen must retreat to b1 in order to defend the bishop. However, now the white bishop will simply move to c3, but not right away. First, bishop d5 check followed. Now, if king moves to g7, then Smyslov gives the following variation. Rook f7 check, king h8, bishop c3 check, knight e5, and now we see the power of this knight. The knight actually controlled all the squares the knight could move from g6. And as soon as the knight moves to e5, of course, white simply eliminates it. And after d takes e, white plays rook takes c7, threatening, deadly, bishop takes e5 check, and after the rook captures, simply checkmate in one move on f8. And there is nothing black can do to avoid the checkmate. That's why after bishop d5 check, Liberzon played king h8. But now, of course, bishop c3 check, knight e5, and knight takes e5, of course. And we can see the perfect harmony of the white pieces. Both bishops complete each other. The light squared bishop and dark squared bishop control all the light and dark squares. And the rooks, of course, cut the king on the f-file. And after d takes e, of course, rook takes e5 followed. And of course, black cannot capture the rook because of bishop takes e5 checkmate. And besides that, white is threatening deadly rook takes e8 with the double check and immediate checkmate. And there is nothing black can do to defend against this terrible threat. That's why, in this position, Liberzon resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Chigorin sacrificed the queen to reach the maximum piece activity and checkmate his opponent. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.